For this presentation, I'll be discussing the historical and cultural significance of Chicago house music and the Chicago house scene, specifically the scene. So, Chicago house was born in the late 70s and thrived throughout the 80s. Some of its prime movers, the people that developed it and came up with the music and helped throughout the scene, were Frankie Knuckles, Larry Levin, and Ron Hardy. Those are just three of a lot of people. But Larry Levin was originally from Brooklyn. He would DJ loft parties, which were parties intended for black and gay crowds. Ron Hardy was best known for DJing at the Music Box, which played Chicago house tracks. He started his career at the gay club, which was called Den 1. Stylistically, he was known for playing a lot of pitched tracks, meaning he would up the BPM to, way higher than it was supposed to be, and it would pitch the track where it would be noticeably higher. And he was also known to play songs with a lot of energy in his mixes. The one I say for last was Frankie Knuckles. He's probably the most important in this movement. He just died recently. He died in 2014. He was also originally from Brooklyn. He's known now as the godfather of house music, which is probably a play on the James Brown title, which is the godfather of soul music. He was inducted in 1996 to Chicago's Gay and Lesbian Hall of Fame, and he was the musical director and DJ at the Warehouse, which is going to be very important, so we'll get back to that. Last, for the prime movers, I wanted to talk about the African American community as well as the gay community. So instead of focusing on individuals, I want to talk about the community. Black influence, African American influence, was the strongest in the creation of house music, the house music scene in general, and the production of the music. Most of the artists that we'll discuss are African American, and obviously the disco roots that it has, and the mixing roots, and all the city roots that the genre has comes from African American culture. So I wanted to list as a prime mover of the culture and of the scene. These clubs are known to be a sanctuary for certain groups. Even still today, we talk about how gay clubs act as sort of a sanctuary and a safe space for gay people to go. So it's really them that kept this movement alive. It derived obviously from the disco scene and moved on to the house scene. It's a necessary way for a lot of gay people to feel safe nowadays. So the question, how would you characterize the way they led others in their particular environment? Well, for this I wanted to discuss the way that hip-hop music and house music influenced each other. Chicago house music, the way that it's formulated, it takes disco samples and mixes it with European electronic music. Hip-hop is very similar to this in the way that it took disco samples and would mix it with breakbeats. Breakbeats being drum beats in 4/4 time signature with, in hip-hop it was generally like 90 to 100 beats per minute. These two styles, like I'm saying, has a deep influence on one another, which goes back to their geographical origins. Hip-hop was founded in the Bronx, where the scene also derived through African-American oppression and disco scene roots. Even to this day, the two scenes continue to have influence on one another. It has been apparent throughout the history of both genres that they have had influence on one another greatly. For instance, certain Chicago DJs like Steve Silk Hurley would try to stand out by incorporating hip-hop tricks, such as scratching and cutting into his mixes on a Chicago radio station. Chicago house has had influence on hip-hop with the introduction of the subgenre, which some have referred to as hip house. This style emerged in the late 1980s with artists rapping over house beats. Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock, It Takes Two, and the Jungle Brothers' I'll House You are perfect examples of this. I'm also reminded of Kanye West's 2016 track Fade. Kanye is Chicago-born, and as somewhat of a tribute to Chicago house, he sampled two songs from this era. They were Mysteries of Love by Mr. Fingers and Deep Inside by Hard Drive. This song was a fairly big hit, showing the influence that Chicago house still has on hip-hop today. So how did the music reflect the nature of the environment from which it emerged? So before I start on this point, it's important for me to note that gospel music also played a very pivotal role in the sort of samples and mixes that they would make for Chicago house music. So one of the points I wanted to get to was that Frankie Knuckles, the DJ that I mentioned before, who worked at the Warehouse, actually, which I'll discuss in my next point, he would play Martin Luther King Jr.'s sermons over certain house tracks. This idea sort of picked up of having sermons played during your mixes, and eventually other artists were playing sermons of Chicago pastors over their music. This kind of shows within the environment of Chicago how the religion could play into a very secular movement, which was the Chicago house scene. I also want to discuss, when it comes to the environment from which it emerged, that the term house music actually came from Chicago. It came from the club, the Warehouse, that DJ Knuckles was the musical director of and that he played at. The club was frequented mostly by gay and Latino men. This was common amongst many disco clubs as well, as we discussed before. The fashion at this club was tied into gay culture as well. Many club goers would shop at Wax Tracks, it was called, which sold leather and studs. There was also, mostly, this is more of a Chicago, like Chicago as a whole kind of a thing, there was a prep culture which emerged within Chicago schools around this time and made its way to the Warehouse around the late 70s. The United States was going through a recession in the early 80s. Chicago was affected very greatly by this. There were massive layoffs, and manufacturing plants had been closing. So in any time of hardship within a community, there are usually always different forms of escapism which take place. In this instance, it seems that themes of Chicago house showed a form of escapism through its use of spiritual and rhythmic themes. For instance, the constant referencing of the dance moves being done to the music could be interpreted as a form of distraction from real-life issues which the community faced. In Chicago house, the major form of dancing was called jacking and was often referenced within the music.
Jack your body, 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 jack your body.